I'm going to be speaking about how Christianity elevates women. And I'd like to especially thank John and his team for putting the Wonder Woman sign on all of what we got here, because that just sets me up well. Okay. I have a question for you guys before we begin, and I can't actually see you because of these lights, so I'm going to do this a second. Raise your hand if you've seen the show Hamilton, either live or on, is it Disney Plus that it's? Okay, so I've got some Hamilton friends here. I went to see that show for my first night out after my now 2-year-old was born. And I went with my husband, who's American, and my best friend, who's American, and her husband, who's American. So it was like 3-on-1 as we're watching this show about how your country got rid of my country. It was kind of hurtful. But I did enjoy it. And there were certain moments that linger in my mind from that show. And one of them is the first time that we meet Eliza, Hamilton's to-be wife. And she's out with her sisters, and they're walking through the streets of New York City. And they have this fun song, which I think is called Work, officially. I'm sure some of you can kind of rap it for us. And there's a particular line where Eliza's sister, Angelica, in fact, all of them, 3 of the sisters together say, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And then Angelica adds, "And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm compelling to put women in the sequel, work," right? Come on, some of you guys have had this show. Thank you. That's a great line, and it gets a laugh and a cheer from the Hamilton audience. But actually, if we think more carefully, then women were explicitly in the original. As John has mentioned to us this morning, from the beginning, God created human beings, male and female, in his image and in his likeness. And today, for many of our friends, especially for our friends who do not identify as Christians, the idea that men and women are fundamentally morally equal, that they have equal worth and dignity, that seems like just a self-evident truth. You don't need any kind of religious worldview to support that idea. But if we look at the history of ideas, if we look at the history of the world, if we look even at cultures today that have not been as informed by Christianity as some have, we'll find it's not a self-evident truth at all. It's not a self-evident truth that all human beings are created equal. It's not a self-evident truth that men and women are fundamentally equal. It is a specifically biblical claim. And this morning, as I've been asked to talk about how Christianity elevates women, there are 3 points that I want to make. And they're all about Jesus. And I think that's okay, because if this weekend is about thinking about the image of God, then the one who is the perfect image of God is the person we should be talking about. The first point is that Jesus defends women. The second is that Jesus disciples women. And the third is that Jesus draws women. So number 1, Jesus defends women. The woman caught in adultery. The sinful woman from the city who weeps on Jesus' feet and wipes them with her hair. The bleeding woman who touches the hem of Jesus' garment. Mary, who sits at Jesus' feet with the other disciples and learns from him. The disabled woman in the synagogue whom Jesus healed. The prostitutes who flocked to him. What do all these women have in common? Jesus defended them. Jesus defended a sinful woman's right to touch him. Jesus defended an unclean woman's right to touch his clothes. Jesus defended a hungry woman's right to learn from him. Jesus defended a disabled woman's right to be healed by him on the Sabbath because she too is a daughter of Abraham. Time and again, as we read the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, we see that Jesus defends women. And that defense was necessary. In the Greco-Roman world into which Christianity was born, it was not at all seen to be true that women were equal to men. One of the ways that we know this is because abandonment of babies was common in those days, and abandonment of baby girls was especially common because girls just weren't as valuable as boys. But time and again, in the Gospels, Jesus defended women, and the Christianity that grew out of his words and his teaching and his life and his beauty defended women too. Now, some folks in this room perhaps, and certainly some of my friends, will start by saying, okay, well, we see that Jesus in the Gospels really champions and defends women, but then Paul comes along and ruins everything, right? Jesus related to women as if they were equal in dignity and worth to men. And then we read Paul talking about marriage in Ephesians 5, and what does he say? Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. When I first really grappled with that text, I was in college at the time. I was a passionate believer in Jesus. And I found that statement extremely hard and painful and frustrating. But what I've realized over time is only reading that statement and not reading what follows is like picking up a note from someone who you thought loved you and reading, I cannot bear you, and putting it down because it hurts too much, when the rest of the note said, I cannot bear you being so far away from me. What does Paul say to husbands? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. People talk often as if this Christian vision of marriage is denigrating to women, as if it puts women down. But imagine if those commands were reversed. Wives, love your husbands as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, dying on a cross for him, for your husband, bleeding for him, giving up everything for him. That's not what the Bible says. In fact, this vision of marriage radically elevates women. In the cultural context of the day, it would have been shocking to hear those words. Husbands weren't expected to be faithful to one woman. It was fine for them to sleep with other women they weren't married to, and actually also to sleep with other men as well. But the Christian vision of marriage, which actually points us to Jesus' love for his church, is specifically designed to protect women. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now let's be very clear. Throughout the last 2,000 years of Christian history, that is often not how we have lived. Often we have lived as if wives are there to serve their husbands, as if the husband's needs matter more than the wives. Often we have denigrated women, thinking that we are being faithful to the scriptures. And often we have talked as if those words from Paul are based on gendered psychology rather than Christ-centered theology. But if we look at the text itself, the reason that Paul tells us these things is not because women are naturally less good leaders than men, or because women are naturally less intelligent than men, or because men are naturally more loving than women. And we can argue about all of those things if we like, but actually what Paul says is it's because of Jesus and the church. That's what this whole thing called marriage is all about. Now, the great irony is that the sexual revolution of the 1960s was sold to us as the liberation of women. For centuries, men had been finding ways to sneak around Christian marriage and have commitment-free sex, and great news, now that we had the pill, women could do that too. But despite increases in freedom and opportunity for women, women's self-reported happiness in America has actually declined since the 60s. Why is that? I believe that part of the reason is that commitment-free sex is a poison chalice. Stable marriage, both for men and women, is correlated with multiple mental and physical health benefits. But for women in particular, increasing our numbers of sexual partners is actually correlated with negative mental health outcomes, higher levels of depression and suicidal ideation, and drug abuse and alcoholism. The idea that tearing down Christian marriage liberates women and is actually good for the thriving of women turns out to be just simply empirically wrong. So where does that leave us? I think sometimes as Christians, we've reacted to this by saying, okay, what we most need to do is we need to defend marriage. And we need to elevate marriage and wifehood and motherhood. And we need to talk as if, and maybe even use these words, a woman's highest calling is to be a wife and a mother. Now let me be very clear, I'm a wife and a mother. And I think those things are profoundly important and high callings. Some of my smartest and most godly friends are full-time at home taking care of their kids. But a woman's highest calling isn't to be a wife and a mother. A woman's highest calling is to follow Jesus. And we can do that as wives and as mothers, and we can do that as single people. We too often in the church, we've elevated marriage at the expense of singleness. When Paul, who had such a high vision of marriage that he compared it to Jesus' love for his church, says singleness is even better. So let's think about how we treat the women in particular in our churches. Do we treat single women as if they, it's sort of unfortunate that they've missed out on this really wonderful thing that marriage is? How do we relate to single mothers in our church? One of the things that's fascinating to me, if you look at the interactions Jesus has with women in the Gospels, so often they're women that nobody else would have gone near. So often it's the sinful women of the city, or it's the prostitutes, or it's the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus shouldn't have been seen dead with the Samaritan woman at the well, who'd had 5 husbands, and who was now living with a man who was not her husband. Jesus shouldn't have been seen dead with the sinful woman of the city who washed his feet with her tears. How do we treat those people in our churches? Are they welcomed? Are they part of the family? Are they drawn in? So that's our first point. Jesus defends women. Second point is this: Jesus disciples women. Let's think for a minute again about that famous encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. Number one, Jews and Samaritans does not associate in those days. So it was very strange for Jesus even to be having that conversation at all. Number two, Jesus is a respectable Jewish rabbi. What's he doing having a private conversation with this woman? Number three, as I mentioned, this woman is notoriously sexually immoral. She's the last person Jesus should have been talking to. And yet Jesus initiates with her the longest private recorded conversation of anyone in all the Gospels. Did you know that? And in John's Gospel, this woman is the first person to whom Jesus reveals himself as the Christ. Jesus engages this woman in an extraordinarily theological conversation. And then he sends her out as a missionary to her people. Because Jesus disciples women. Or think of Mary and Martha when Jesus is at their house. Martha is busy doing the traditional female thing. She's serving. She's cooking, doing all the stuff. Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet listening to him with the other disciples. Martha comes to Jesus and says, "Lord, can you just tell her to help me? Like, who does she think she is, sitting there with the male disciples while I'm doing all the work here?" Jesus says that she has chosen the better portion and it will not be taken away from her. But Jesus isn't finished with Martha. When we meet these two sisters later in John's Gospel, it's after their brother Lazarus has died. It's after Jesus has deliberately let their brother Lazarus die so that he can come and have that extraordinary theological conversation with Martha, where he says those life-changing words, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though he dies, will live, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" John's Gospel is famous for Jesus' "I am" statements. Almost all of them are delivered to groups. But this one, "I am the resurrection and the life," is delivered specifically to Martha. He looks into this grieving woman's eyes and speaks those life-changing words. And then he asks her, "Do you believe this?" She says, "Yes, Lord." Jesus disciples women. And again, if we look back at the last 2,000 years of Christian history, we will see ways in which we as Christians have honored this and ways in which we haven't. We'll see church contexts where women's learning, like true biblical learning, has been valued and invested in and expected, where women's minds have been challenged. And we'll also see contexts where women have sort of been treated like they don't really have a functioning brain, and that the Lord certainly doesn't expect them to use it. How do we think about discipleship of women in our churches? Is it something that we care about like Jesus cared about it? Do we challenge women theologically like Jesus did? Do we invest in women theologically like Jesus did? That brings us to our third point, which is that Jesus draws women. The Greco-Roman world into which Christianity was born, experts think that there could have been as much as 2/3 men versus women, due to a combination of women dying in childbirth and selective infanticide of little baby girls. But from all we can tell from historical records, the early church was as much as 2/3 female. So we have a disproportionately male culture and a disproportionately female church. In fact, early on, Christianity was mocked as being a religion of women and slaves and little children. And you know what? It was true. And it's still true today. I sometimes hear people lament the reality that in America, church is a majority female. In fact, if you look at the statistics, I think currently it's about 40% of women in America who go to church every week and about 31% of men. Now, do we need to invest in making sure that we're meeting the spiritual needs of men? Yes. But this discrepancy is not actually something that's unique to our time and our culture. It's not just a product of sort of the feminization of the church or something, as folks sometimes claim. It's actually been a reality throughout all of history. If you look at the church today in China, which is growing so fast that by 2030 there will be more Christians in China than in America, and where some experts, leading experts of sociology of religion in China, think that China could be even a majority Christian country by 2060. Again, you have a society that is disproportionately male because of the selective abortion of little baby girls, and you have a church that is disproportionately female. Why? Because Jesus draws women. Now, as I say, all I'm doing is quoting sort of statistics and historical perspectives on this. And people sometimes ask me, why do you think that is? Like, well, what is the theological reason for the fact that it seems like there will be more women in the new creation than there are men? I don't know. But if I had to guess, it would be because Christianity is at its heart good news for the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized. It's good news for the weak and not for the strong. And to the extent that women historically and that women's bodies naturally, even today, are weaker than men's, perhaps it's unsurprising that disproportionately Jesus draws women. Now, going back to our moment of Hamilton, in order to believe that God created human beings equal, that it is a self-evident truth that both men and women are created equal, we don't need Thomas Jefferson to come back and write a sequel for us. We need Jesus Christ, who is the image of the invisible God, who's already written the script. We need to go back to him and learn from him. And we need to see that Jesus defends women, Jesus disciples women, and Jesus draws women. So will we as well? Thank you.